I'd like to start to open this session today. To open formally, let me return to the title of this forum, Planetary Feminisms, Decoloniality, Ecological Thinking, Creative Praxis. This title is something that I rehearsed many times, and the event indeed itself, the event as a whole, has been brewing for some number of years. The impetus that finally pushed the button to allow it to happen really was the publication in January of the second volume in a trilogy that I've been writing on transnational feminisms and the arts since 2017. Those are the books on the side. They're getting off the screen because we're not going to spend time looking at the books. But having had the second one come out, it really seemed like the absolute moment to ask some of these questions around planetary feminisms, decoloniality, ecological thinking, and creative praxis. And it pushed me to try to organize something about that. The first volume of that trilogy was really very much about the politics of transversal dialogue, about knowing, imagining, and inhabiting Earthwide and Otherwise. And the second volume has taken a turn toward notions of transhemispheric histories. How do we understand what might be a global but also a planetary history? How might we story pluriversal worlds or world pluriversal stories otherwise? What does it mean to talk about the ecologies and genealogies or worlds and stories with which we know and understand the world? And in particular, my sense of this as being absolutely a pivotal project between decoloniality and eco-criticality, that they are the profound sort of trajectories of a feminist project, a planetary feminist project. More pointedly, I suspect I could say the planetary feminisms are at their very best decolonial, race-critical, queer, trans, and ecological ways of thinking, knowing, and doing, and that they mobilize through creative praxis the crossings and connections of the translocal, regional, national, the transversal, the transcorporeal, the trans-scalar, the transcanonical, and the transhemispheric. These are all spaces that exist at the nexus of bodies, spaces, and times. It's my contention that the decolonial, eco-critical planetarity of transnational feminisms in the arts can indeed begin to unravel the extractive, Eurocentric, and anthropocentric ways of knowing that have led to genocides, femicides, ecocides, and epistemicides for centuries. What they lead to, I'm hoping, is not just an unraveling, but rather a constructive building toward mutual flourishing, toward the relationships between human and more than human Earth others, by mobilizing creativity, but also pivotally dialogue. And in relation to this trans-hemispheric dialogue, a dialogue that crosses and connects, is really kind of pivotal. And I cite Chris J. Cuomo, the ecofeminist philosopher, who said, any piece of philosophy is merely a part of a conversation. And in thinking about that, I also cite and use as another kind of trajectory for this, the very specific words of Audre Lorde, that we have many different faces and we do not have to become each other in order to work together. And with that said, I am very, very pleased to start the process of opening Roundtable 3, where we begin to take in the Atlantic. We begin to look at how the Americas are constructed by a dialogue with the rest of the world, and they are plural Americas, I hasten to add. An African and European way of understanding the role of globality and the role of the Atlantic in relation to notions of globality, but also quite specifically a way of understanding the world where we start to understand a transoceanic history, a way of understanding globality as being a question about the human and a question about the way in which the human and the global emerge in unison. But more to the point about that the very constitution of the human is a question about the constitution of planetarity, that humanimality, new materialism, the matter of the world, the cosmos are all profoundly entangled. And as we move to this particular roundtable, we will look again at some of the questions that were raised in earlier ones, particularly around this notion of what role a new materialism might have, but also specifically the kinds of roles that care might have, the politics of care in thinking about planetarity. And with that said, I open the roundtable to the speakers.
The planetary is personal, the personal is planetary. These two sentences, as short as they are, help us recognize that taken together, the planetary and the personal require us to rethink, relearn, redo, remake, and imagine otherwise what it means to be living as human beings with a wounded and broken planet that is in need of healing. This planet constitutes us as human beings. How does one relate to scales of concern, scales of care, and scales of worry that are at the same time personal and planetary? How does one learn to imagine the planet inside of oneself? How does one learn how to feel the planet inside of oneself? What are the inherited epistemological limitations and constraints, largely caused by the violence of abstraction and compulsory either / or ways of thinking and mentalities, which make it so very difficult to think oneself as part of the planet? Patriarchal colonial approaches to this planet have been dominated by the violence of terraforming and masterminding. This patriarchal colonial mindset, which keeps changing and reproducing and changing and reproducing, has transformed the planet into a resource for extraction. This patriarchal colonial mindset has abused the planet. Now I want to quote from a 1997 lecture given by Gayatri Chakraborty-Spivak. The lecture was titled Imperative to Reimagine the Planet. It was first published in a bilingual version in German and English in 1991. The following sentences are quoted from the lecture. The globe is on our computers. It is the logo of the World Bank. No one lives there. And we think that we can aim to control globality. The planet is in the species of authority, belonging to another system, and yet we inhabit it, indeed are it. It is not really amenable to contrast the planet with the globe. And I continue quoting. I have spent a good long time speaking of reconstellating the responsibility thinking of pre-capitalist societies into the abstractions of the democratic structures of civil society, to use the planetary, if such a thing can be used, to control globalization interruptively, to locate the imperative in the indefinitely radical authority of the outer space of a planet, to deflect the rational imperative of capitalist globalizations, to displace dialogics into this set of contradictions. And now I stop quoting from this text. How to reimagine the planet again and again and again in the here and now. The scale and the time of the planet seem so very different from the scale and the time of human beings, yet they're most intricately bound up with each other. What we do, what human beings do to the planet, with the planet, on the planet, human beings also do to themselves. This relation has been deeply and thoroughly cut and violated by patriarchal colonial logics of globalizing the planet. In order to approach the planetary as personal and the personal as planetary, I also want to quote from an other thinker who has more recently written about the planetary and feminism. I'm quoting from Margarita Tsomu's text, Care and Regeneration Work in the Paradigm of Ecological Catastrophes, the subtitle of which is Attempt at a Planetary Feminism. Tsomu writes, from a planetary feminist perspective, nature, body, and woman would thus not be biological fixations, but rather materialized relations that are evaluated in a historical context. I would therefore like to propose to no longer speak of the problematic nexus of woman and nature, but rather, with regard to these relations, to focus on the nexus between social reproduction and planetary regeneration in order to formulate feminism as a political project that interrelates the question of gender with the planetary. I continue quoting. The central relationship that planetary feminism is interested in and that needs to be restructured or repaired is our relationship to the sphere of reproduction, to social and planetary reproduction, or better, in the words of the political scientist Christine Bauhart, reproductivity. Stop quote. Planetary feminism, in my understanding, is care feminism. Care joins together social/ecological reproduction, socio-environmental reproduction, and an ethical perspective of care within this. To think that the personal is planetary and the planetary is personal, one can start thinking about breathing or drinking. We are, to quote Astrida Naimani's, bodies of water. We are, as I would like to suggest, bodies of air. As bodies of water and air, we are planetary bodies. These bodies need as much care as the air we breathe in and the water we drink. By seeking to decenter the human, planetary rights to care become an ethical obligation that also require to distribute planetary cares and worries otherwise and justly. So maybe I was shorter than 10 minutes.
Had to unmute myself first. So I'm Katve-Kaisa Kontturi, joining from Turku. Pretty snowy at the moment here on the west coast of Finland. I'm very happy to be here and happy to be invited to have a chance to engage in this discussion. Yes, but I'll start by making an acknowledgement. So the conceptual setup of my presentation relates to the article New Materialism and the Study of Arts, a mapping of co-emergence, which should be out in the end of April in the book Methods and Genealogies of New Materialism by Edinburgh University Press. This article was co-written with colleague musicologist Milla Tiainen, my co-worker on arts and new materialisms since early 2000s. And the key concepts of this article, the work of art, co-creation, and not co-agency, as stands on my slide, and aesthetic activism are central to my presentation today. The article and also this presentation claim that development of the so-called new materialisms, both conceptually and as a range of research practices, has significantly occurred within arts. That is, their relationship, as I see it, is co-constitutive. When writing this presentation, I went back to Marsha Meskimmon's book, Women Making Art, History, Subjectivity, Aesthetics, published in 2003, 20 years ago. The book that then both inspired and encouraged my developing interest in the materialities and the work of art. And I noticed with pleasure that in the introduction of that book, Marsha makes a similar sort of claim, namely that art does not illustrate or represent certain concepts, but rather instantiates them, which is the attitude that continues in the book that this event celebrates today. In the mentioned article, we don't write with the work of staple art by or with Sassa Huber, which is companion to my presentation today, but with many other artists whose work, like Sasha's, travels across continents transhemispherically. Such is actually the journey of the mentioned article too, but I have no time to go into that one. So I'll go to Sasha. Sasha Huber lives and works in Finland, has Haitian, and Swiss origin, and in her art critically addresses histories and issues through her roots both in the post-colonial Caribbean and mostly white and racist Central Europe. In this presentation, I suggest that her aesthetically appealing, sparkling, shimmering, glimmering, staple art makes structures and practices of racism and colonialism felt. I start with the series firsts that recognizes the lives of Black pioneers with varying geographical, occupational, and activist backgrounds by portraying them in staples, and we'll end up with the melting icebergs. In the picture on the left, Sasa Huber is working with a pneumatic stable gun that has been her major tool or collaborator since early 2000s. This particular photo was taken in Rome, and it documents a moment in a durational performance that she did with the staple gun, where the audience could follow them working on the portrait of one of the firsts, Edmonia Lewis, the first Black woman artist, a sculptor in Rome in late 19th century. The process of creating the portrait took nearly a week, during which, staple by staple, the glimmering composition, characterized by clever changes of direction and rhythms, grew, and slowly a portrait co-emerged on the black acoustic panel. In the process, the artist wore ear and eye protection and overalls too. The protective gear Huber is wearing not only points out that the art is often embodied work, but it points also to the processes of making it can have harmful effects on the body of the human maker too. And this is also what Barbara Bald, Australian artist and theorist who has worked with the concept of work of art for a long time, has suggested, among other things. It is in the intensive work of art where friction occurs between different materials, including matters of art, staples included here, cultural discourses, environment, atmosphere, tools, and the materiality of artist body, to list a few. It is in this intensive energetic event that a new work of art, such as these staple works, emerge. And this is to say that the work of art, staple or not, is always work of collaboration. It is co-creation. For Huber, shooting staples form portraits. Shooting staples to form portraits of Black people is a conscious choice of co-creation. This is apparent from, for example, in the series titled Shooting Back, that commemorates Black people shot dead. In the series firsts, however, she shoots Black pioneers to make them visible. The picture on the right presents a detail of the portrait of Rosa Emilia Clay, a teacher trained in Finland and the first Black citizen of Finland as well, who was brought here in the end of 19th century by missionaries who worked in the area nowadays known as Namibia in Africa. In this tightly cropped picture, we can only see her eye, brow, and bit of her hairline. I ponder a lot whether it would be fair to show only one eye of hers. But then again, I find that the constricted framing chosen here is visually and aesthetically appealing as such, and as such, I hope that it will powerfully draw attention to her and to her story. The cropped eye also makes a reference to bell Hooks's oppositional gaze. Rosa Emilia looks us back to tell the story of the Black woman's transhemispheric colonial life. What the detail shows as well is how the staple portraits are composed. It reveals the technique attesting to the work of staple art that made her visible for us here and now. Work of staple art, the glimmering, sparkling attraction of it, is not just about aestheticizing the ugly and painful truth about colonialization. By means of their technique, pain things, as Sasa Huber calls them, might trigger sensations of pain. When shooting staples, the sharp metal permeates the black fabric of the canvas. For some, or maybe many of us, This might recall the experience of staple missing its target and instead piercing one's own skin, which happens incredibly quickly and there is rarely visible mess involved. The staple hugs the skin so snugly, but violently too. So, yes, yeah. So finally, let's focus on the middle. The tipping of the iceberg is a work of staple art that sparkles with flowing prose of silvery surface that instantiates the movement and tremor of melting ice. The stapling technique is the same as before, but now executed on whitewashed plywood. This silvery whiteness accentuates the dangerous beauty of polar spaces, explored, conquered by white people who are mostly responsible for their current destruction as well, and for the consequences that are most tragically felt in post-colonial communities of the South. The staple works that I have presented do not profess or preach, that is my claim. They render current political issues to be felt, sensed. In the creative work of staple art, aesthetics and the affective power of materials are not subordinated to political messages. Instead, politics emerges in collaboration with these materials. This is what aesthetic activism does. And in Shasha's work, it sparkles, it glimmers, it shimmers, it attracts, and it offers sensations to be felt in one's body. And doing so, it trusts in art's capacity to engage and reshape individual and collective somatic experiences and world relations by sensorial means, through vibrations, tones, textures, and durations. That was it. Thank you.
Anna Gabriela, we think you might be on mute. Anna Gabriela? We think you might be on mute. Can you hear us? Can you tell? Anna Gabriela, I think you might be muted. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Let me go back for you.
Yes, it's okay now? It's okay?
Start now. Start now.
Right, weird. Anyway, sorry about it. So I'll start. So good afternoon, everyone. As I was saying, everybody participating in this roundtable, and thank you very much to Marsha Meskimmon for the organization of this wonderful transnational seminar and inviting us all in. It's fantastic to be able to share experience of our work, our dreams, as well as our fears and anxieties among such a wide and diversified group of colleagues from different parts of the world. From my part, and in order not to lose the focus and time allotted, I'll be mostly concentrating on a recent project developed by the research group I coordinate at my university, which is funded by the Portuguese Science Foundation, and a project that started in 2017 under the title Women, Arts and Dictatorship, Portugal, Brazil, and Portuguese-speaking African countries. And the image that you see by Monica and Miranda has accompanied us throughout. As I was saying, this project has been developed by an interdisciplinary research group in arts, gender, and post-colonial studies, based at Universidade do Minho, which is in the north of Portugal, and attached to a research center in the humanities. A group composed of senior and junior researchers, which have been collaborating and developing research in the interface of the named fields of research for over 2 decades now. Conferences, workshops, and seminars have been organized, joint publications and projects were developed, MA and PhD dissertations have been submitted over the years. All in all, the group gathers researchers whose academic background encompasses literature, the visual arts, film, theater, performance, and translation studies. Moreover, our common framework goes without saying, feminist and gender studies in a transnational and intersectional perspective. So within the multidisciplinary project referred to, we aim to make visible the presence of women artists in the 20th century in Portugal and in Portuguese-speaking countries as creators of artistic and literary canons by contributing through the analysis of situated case studies to a history of the histories of art and literature with a focus on the Portuguese dictatorship and the creation of the so-called Estado Novo, new state, by Salazar from 1933 to 1974, when the Carnation Revolution took place. Taking into account the invisibility of women as artists, artistic creators, and their representation in the history of art and literature, dealing in different ways, formats, and genres with aspects of the dictatorship, and devising forms of resistance too, we aim to contribute to a revision and reconfiguration of the artistic and literary canon of the 20th century, having Portugal as axis and conducting contrastive or complementary case studies with the former African colonies of Portugal and Brazil. So globally, the project included two stages. One, an analysis of the work of an older generation of women artists who directly experienced the dictatorship and exhibited that in their work. Two, an analysis of the work of women from a younger generation who have or are producing work which critically reflects on these regimes. The targets of our analysis, broadly speaking, is on the following issues: political repression, censorship, the colonial war, historical silencing of women, education, gender politics and feminism, immigration, exile, and diaspora. The anchoring of these issues in the matrix of the Portuguese language and of female artistic creation in dictatorial contexts, struggling against invisibility and or repression and censorship, is and has been our main goal. We aimed to reflect on one hand on how the dominant ideology marked the female artistic practices and concomitantly the forms of resistance engendered by women creators. Our methodology included the following activities: the creation of platforms, digital platforms, to disseminate the activities carried out, a series of work-in-progress seminars with invited guest speakers, interviews with artists and curators, film cycles, thematic workshops, roundtables in international conferences, short course in international conference, etc., etc. And it's important to underline that we also collaborated a lot with museums' educational services, for example. We organized publications, namely a journal edited by our research center, a volume of text, critical text in Portuguese, and now we are editing one in English. On a personal note, I'd like to underline that the making of this project helped the whole research group and those that got involved in our activities to survive through the 2 years of the pandemic in better spirits, creating solidarity and affective ties, feeling the closeness of the group and the importance of what we were doing together, despite it all. I would also like to underline the involvement with the community, as I was saying, and the geographical decentralization of our activities, since we are in the north, not in Lisbon, as a differentiating factor of this project. Throughout its making, the project raised a number of questions, which kind of, we carried through all these years, and that we kept confronting. Here are some of them. One, what characteristics define the work of these women as a reaction to the dominant authoritarian ideology, either as a symbolic system of representation that reflects a given historical situation of domination, or as a structure of values that shapes a certain reality? Two, What is the role of women and their artistic practices as a mode of resistance to such repressive ideology? 3, how do these practices work as instrumental forms of denunciation of a system that has been imposed over several decades? 4, how do the recent generations of women artists revisit this particular historical moment in their art, through which means and strategic practices, which is to say, how is memory and post-memory articulated, for example? As already said, we wanted this project to explore a localized, comparative, and interdisciplinary methodology in the articulation between different art forms with feminist and gender studies, a methodology that is still in need of further development in the Portuguese context. Thus, our aim was not just to expand an existing canon so as to make women more visible, but to question the canon itself by introducing different paradigms that emerge when looking across the fields and disciplines as a transnational and intersectional context. In the light of this framework, for example, to look at the Portuguese dictatorship marked by repression, censorship, and the colonial conflict in dialogue with the Brazilian military junta, 1964-85, and the African Portuguese-speaking countries undergoing decolonization, can introduce significant new perspectives to the reading of women's artistic creation, their forms of struggle, and material modes of resistance. Thank you very much.
So what I've got here is a slide to try and cover sort of intertwined strands of my research interests. So before I get started again, I just kind of want to say thank you to Marsha and everyone for enabling me to be part of this conversation. We've had fabulous conversations already this morning, and I'm really keen to keep those going. So my interests, my work are very much lodged in the corporeal. And what initially started as an interest in how hybrid bodies, sort of complicated gender norms, really expanded to become an interest in the very corporeal nature of those bodies. And my interest also expanded from hybrids in terms of a mixture of human and animal to thinking about not only other kinds of hybrids in sort of intertwined with the human, but multiplicitous bodies where we see an entanglement of not just the human, but a range of different organic and inorganic entities as well. So my interest is really thinking about, well, how are these different entities intertwined? And why are the entities that are not human, why are they labeled as other? What makes them other? How are they othered? And how do we kind of push the boundaries around sort of these ideological and taxonomic norms through this sort of blurring, this corporeal blurring? And what is really interesting to me is that a lot of these blurrings and these sort of blurred corporeal forms, whether it's a kind of hybrid or whether it's a kind of more multiplicitous body, whether we're talking about a mixture of organic entities or a mixture of organic and inorganic entities, they're so often viewed as monsters and the monstrous. So one of my areas of interest is in sort of popular culture around sci-fi and fantasy and horror, because this is where you sort of see a lot of these bodies appearing. So I am ever so slightly obsessed with Alien and the Alien franchise. So I've got here one of the original pieces of concept art for the original Alien film by Geiger. And when you look at these original pieces of concept art, the bodies of the alien are actually humanoid. They have very clear human arms and legs. And in this one that I'm showing here, I suppose you could call it the external mouth, very clearly has human teeth. So there is a very clear human element in this body, and yet it becomes monstrously other because of the way in which it is combined with something else. But in looking at these blurrings and sort of unpicking their positioning within culture, I'm really wary of reducing this to simply, I suppose, the opposite of the universal white, Western, hegemonic, heterosexual, able-bodied human or man, as it were. And in thinking about challenging that notion of what is a human body, I don't want to sort of start from the position of that kind of hegemonic normative body. So one of the things that I'm thinking about or trying to work through is how this sort of intersects with Zakiya Iman-Jackson's work around anti-Blackness and the post-human. And I think her work is really becoming kind of a touchstone in this area. And she argues, and I'm going to quote her here, that discourses on non-human animals and animalized humans, Black people specifically in her work, are forged through each other. So they reiterate that idealized, colonialized conception of human. And that's kind of what I want to avoid in thinking about this challenge to the human body that is affected through these blurrings. So ultimately, I take a similar position to Jackson in that the human, whatever that is in its current form, needs to be dissolved, and it needs to be reconstituted in a way that recognizes these inextricable interactions, to use Karen Barad's phrase, with other organic and inorganic entities. And within contemporary art, this leads me to be very interested in the work of people like Wangechi Mutu and Lee Bull, who do engage with these kinds of blurring of corporeal boundaries and envisaging the human or a different idea of what the human might be or could be through these different sort of corporeal forms. However, having said all of that, my own research at the moment, the projects that I work on are not actually concerned with popular culture or with contemporary art. I work very specifically on the artist, designer, writer, Leonor Feeney. And in her work, yes, there are absolutely these corporeal crossings, usually human and animal crossings. She's ever so slightly obsessed with sphinxes. I have an alien fixation, she has a sphinx fixation. But there are other sorts of crossings that appear in her work as well. And also she crosses art historical taxonomic categories as well, because, as I say, she's not just an artist, she's a designer. She's not just a designer, she's a writer. And in the many years that I've been working on Leonor Feeney, it has become very clear to me that writing about her in sort of the traditional art historic ways just doesn't work. That structure doesn't allow me to explore the entangled strands of her practice, and it also doesn't enable me to convey the same sense of metamorphosis that is central to her work. So in my current project, I'm trying to use metamorphosis as an art historical strategy. This is very much informed by post-human theory and post-human thinking, whereby instead of giving sort of one linear narrative. And so, you know, this is me, the author, and this is exactly what you must think and exactly what the truth is about Feeney and her work. I'm writing it, or hoping to write it, as a kind of choose your own adventure thing, which has come about through actually conversations with some of the PhD students at Loughborough, including Marluce, so that the author, the reader, sorry, can pick their way through the text. They can skip over chunks and go other places. And Feeney and her chimera periodically interrupt the narrative to present other viewpoints and argue with me, the author. So it is not one monolithic story. So another kind of key question that I have that I'm just going to put out there as a finishing moment is that how can or how do these concepts of becoming, these concepts of reconstituting the human, how do they enable inclusive forms of belonging? I mean, in the last panel, we were talking about home and these ideas of home. So do these sort of reconstituting of the notion of human, can that help create a more inclusive idea of home, for example? And within our own disciplines, how might this help a more inclusive, more complex, more interactive narrative, history, if you like? And that's me, I'll stop there.
Hello, everybody. What's great about being in this position actually is I'm seeing so many wonderful connections between what I hope to say and what has been said. There's some really fantastic ideas. The idea of the planetary being personal is very interesting to me, especially in connection to the work that I'll be discussing, that is very much an expression of this artist's own sort of trans-regional movements, Yasha Kolosinski. What you're seeing is a silhouette of the Zili down toward the Black Madonna. And I'm going to give you a bit of context about Azili and the Black Madonna to kind of underscore the materiality, which I'll get to sort of later. So this is part of the Creole Archive, and it's inspired by a lot of Yasha Kolosinski's visits to Little Haiti, an area of Miami that's named for the many Haitian refugees of the 1980s who settled there. The site includes many restaurants, cultural centers, and bookstores that broadly deal with the African diaspora. And during his visits, he would see many depictions of the Haitian voodoo spirit Azili that resembled the doleful Black Madonna of Czestochowa, a 4-foot-high religious icon of the Virgin Mary, with which he was familiar having grown up in Poland in the 1970s, 1980s. Both Azili and the Black Madonna have darker skin and 2 slashes on their cheeks. And their similarity is not accidental, and Kolosinski was very aware of this. The transnational materialization of the Black Madonna as Azili can be traced back to the presence of Poles in Haiti in the early 19th century. And the movement of the Madonna from Poland to Haiti, and indeed to Miami, maps almost exactly the artist's shift from Krakow, Poland, which he left soon after Soviet rule ended, to Miami, where he's now lived more years than in Eastern Europe. So while the Black Madonna is based in Poland, her origin story or story suggests she was born out of much more expansive trans-regional movements. There are several stories about the origin of the Madonna. One of them indicates she was painted by the Apostle St. Luke on a table used by the Holy Family 2,000 years ago. Indeed, the icon was already considered miraculous when it was brought to Poland. All accounts agree that the Black Madonna was brought to Czestochowa during the 14th century. Around 1430, looters broke the wooden board supporting the canvas and slashed it. And medieval restorers were unaware of the encaustic method, and their attempts to restore were very unsuccessful. Several years later, the image was removed entirely and replaced with a new image of Madonna, where one cheek bears these 2 scars, referencing where the saber slashes of the paintings took place. Moreover, in a fire in the monastery, darkened the pigments and transformed the skin tone on her face to a burnt sienna color. So both the scars and skin color illustrate that she survived these calamities. Now, but the phenomenon itself have been brought to Haiti by Poles in the early 19th century. In 1802, 20,000 soldiers, a quarter of which were from the area now known as Poland, were sent by Napoleon Bonaparte to Saint-Domingue, France's wealthiest colony, to quell a rebellion led by the General Toussaint Louverture, a formerly enslaved man. A year before this, Saint-Domingue adopted a constitution that abolished slavery and declared Louverture leader for life. Opposed soldiers eventually became sympathetic to the cause of the enslaved population. They saw themselves in their struggle for independence against a mighty power. In 1797, Habsburg Austria, the Kingdom of Prussia, and the Russian Empire signed a treaty effectively dissolving the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Poles had allied themselves with the French in the hopes that they would help win back their independence. When the rebels won the revolution in 1804, Saint-Domingue became officially named Haiti, and the country's first president, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, famously said that the Polish were the white Negroes of Europe, given that Poles and Haitians shared similar stories of oppression and rootlessness. Dessalines guaranteed citizenship to any Pole who wanted it. Many of the original contingents of Polish soldiers had succumbed to yellow fever or died in battle. Still, about 400 of the survivors remained in the community now known as La Polonia. As the Poles settled down, their traditions began to meld with local ones, and they resulted in the famous Polish icon of the Virgin Mary becoming a syncretic goddess in the Caribbean. In Haiti and its diaspora, the Black Madonna with the two telltale scars on her face and darker skin is the Azili Danto. Now, voodoo practices are thought to be brought from the Fon people of present-day Benin, who were enslaved, and others from West Africa brought to Haiti. And while the day-to-day practices of voodoo are attended to by women, few of the religion's spirit forces are feminine spirits. Azili is the exception. She represents love, sexuality, prosperity, pleasure, maternity, creativity, and fertility forces. Medivine and Mycece, or trans-masculine and trans-feminine Haitians, are often under Azili Danto's patronage. And given Catholic and Protestant spiritual communities do not necessarily welcome gender and sexuality non-conforming subjects, it's not surprising that they are attracted to Azili and the voodoo religion. So voodoo has a queer presence and arguably a queer past. In fact, the Haitian Revolution, in some accounts, began with the appearance of Azili Danto at a voodoo ceremony on August 1791. Now, worth noting that the plastic that Kolchinsky utilizes to print his Madonnas is made of sugar and corn, and in this way obliquely references Haitian plantation culture. Haiti was France's wealthiest colony because of its sugar production. The physical process of printing his sculptures requires an incredible amount of heat. The plastic melts at roughly twice the temperature to boil water and recalls the dangerous process of sugar refinement. In 1894, the Illustrated American magazine described the process as very wild and terrible, like a caged cyclone, and morbidly notes that a worker had only one hope of escaping perpetual torture, death. Now, I want to kind of talk about the glitter that you see here. And glitter, of course, comes in a variety of shapes, size, and colors. And what I'm interested here is kind of connecting glitter to Glissant's ideas of opacity, this idea that he very much felt like there would be this kind of interconnected world that everyone would need the right not to be known. And the glitter sort of scatters light. It prevents the kind of clarity, even as it also connects, I think, broadly to LGBTQ culture. But glitter is also a microplastic. And microplastic makes up a majority of the ocean pollution that we have. So you might say this glitter is almost like a Derradian pharmacon. It's both a cure and a poison to a certain degree. This entire sort of presentation is meant to sort of function as a kind of archipelago, bringing together North America, Africa, the Caribbean, Eastern Europe. Glissant wrote about the archipelago as this wonderful formation where there's all these individual islands that are both one, and because they're connected to the other ones, as multiple. And this multiplicity and singularity really kind of emerges, I think, from this sculpture, which actually fits into the size of your hand. And that's important to point out because the way in which it's depicted here might appear to be larger than life, is actually smaller than life, you might say. And that contradiction, I think, very much speaks to the complex sort of trans-regional movements. Now, the Black Madonna has more recently become actually an icon of the LGBT community in Poland. So the queerness of the Izili Danto in Haiti has sort of come full circle back to Poland as a manifestation of queer identity there. So I'll stop there.